Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel really honored to be invited back. This was an excellent rotation for me, and what an important topic that I think needs more attention. And so I'm going to try to keep, the teaching portion to a minimum because ain't nobody want to go back to that. But we have the kind of basics of sickle cell. We'll just start at ground level and just make sure everyone is on the same page about what we're talking about. And of course, it probably goes without saying, but you should realize we are talking about blood. And if that makes you uncomfortable, I understand. Feel free, especially if you're not feeling well, walk away, close your eyes. I'm not offended. I'll assume I was boring, but I'm not too offended. And I won't be showing any needles or anything, so don't worry there. I also just wanted to say, I'll talk about sickle cell disease, but when I refer to sickle cell anemia or hemoglobin SS disease, all of that kind of, for today's purposes, means the same thing. All right, so in terms of the impact, you're probably going to hear more statistics today, but it's a really significant problem. Even in the US alone, we have over 100,000 individuals that are affected with sickle cell. And that sounds like just a number, but think about that. That's each individual person split across 100,000 of your neighbors, your relatives, your friends. The majority of these are going to be non-Hispanic Black individuals. And actually, out of those that are born in this country, 1 in 365 are born with sickle cell disease. So it is a significant problem, even in our community. And it also disproportionately affects the Hispanic or Latinx population as well. And I want to bring up, we're talking about individuals. They have a shortened life expectancy by as much as 20 or more years. So it's still a very significant problem, and especially in terms of getting access to healthcare. The more treatment we can give and the more awareness we have, the better we can make the lives throughout the course of history moving forward. So yeah, a little bit of teaching, just what causes sickle cell disease. I just want you to know it's not infectious. It's not because of something that these individuals did. It just happens that they were born to parents that both probably, most likely, had sickle cell trait, which just means that they had one of the genes, but they weren't actually affected by sickle cell disease themselves. And so if an individual gets 2 copies of this affected gene, they themselves will have sickle cell disease. Go ahead and click forward. Sorry, I really raced through these first couple slides. And the 2 abnormal copies are going to create kind of these abnormal building blocks of a thing called hemoglobin. So that's our oxygen carrying capacity in the cell. The red cells are all about moving oxygen around. And so you're just basically having, some broken building blocks or broken Legos for your sickle cell disease. And when you have that, it actually goes from being kind of this small protein structure to these long inflexible chains. And if you think about a red cell, it needs to flow all around your body and squeeze through tiny, tiny capillaries, which are tiny arteries. And it needs to move past other red cells and bounce off and keep moving. But when you have this inflexible protein, it creates this sickle shape, that's a photo of a sickle. Not often do we see those anymore. And if you click again, you can kind of see why we call it that, is these cells that are red cells that look like sickles. You kind of have to, use your imagination, but that's why they're called that. And they're very inflexible, and you can see they have sharp edges. They're going to get caught on each other as they're moving through, and so that's part of the problem. So moving forward. Like I said, these cells, they are not as able to flow easily through the blood vessels, and so they're going to cause all sorts of different problems in our sickle cell patients. One of them being vasoocclusion, it's just a fancy way of saying that they're going to get caught on each other and they're going to clog up some of these vessels and cause clots. That's going to cause a lot of our problems, including the chronic pain that a lot of these individuals undergo just day to day, and then also kind of in an acute way, they have these crises of pain where they often have to be admitted. They also are going to have issues with their eyes. The small vessels in the eyes often are affected. They can have strokes because you're getting the clots in the brain. Really significant outcomes from the fact we just have a different cell shape. They also are going to have things like anemia. These cells are a little less able to tolerate stresses, and so they're going to break apart, and you end up being anemic, which means that you don't have as much oxygen flowing around your body because you have fewer cells, and therefore you tend to be really fatigued. You can also have a lot of the breakdown products, get yellow eyes, jaundice, and even kidney stones from that. I'm barely touching on all the effects of sickle cell disease, but ultimately it's going to have significant outcomes. These patients are also more likely to be infected with just, either bacterial or viral diseases or issues because of the fact that their inflammatory systems are kind of misregulated. All of these things together are going to affect some of the organs as well. You tend to have what we say, splenic infarct, or kind of a death of your spleen, which often helps prevent you from getting particular sicknesses. And then things like I said already, the stroke and issues with your cardiac vessels, also your kidneys. It's going to really have an effect on the whole body. And so how do we treat this? A lot of the options are kind of shown there, but we are going to first try to screen. And so if we suspect that you have sickle cell trait or you have it run through your family, we can figure out if any of your offspring are likely to have sickle cell disease. We can then also screen them for higher risk of stroke, try to prevent that early on. But then we also need to do other things that are preventative, like giving vaccines and just being kind of more proactive with pain management and things. Often goes into the realm of medications. So we're using things like analgesics or just pain meds. We're using folic acid because you have more cell turnover, so your body needs more support. We're using things like hydroxyurea, helps prevent some of these crises, but also, it's challenging for some people to tolerate. And then we have other kind of more broad management. So staying hydrated, really important for our patients because we want to make sure that that flow through the vessels is as easy as possible, which is much easier when you have a lot of fluid involved. And then, trying to avoid, of course, it's very difficult, but extreme weather patterns. Very hard in Iowa because we're about to have 96-degree heat. And also we have, minus 40 in the winter. So really difficult. And then finally, kind of what I'm going to focus on, other than I should also touch on, we have some curative ideas. So things like a stem cell transplant, and then also some of the genetic therapies that are going on right now. But what I really want to focus on is blood transfusion, because of course we're here at ImpactLife, and blood transfusion and blood exchange are probably what I interact with the most. And it's pretty, easy to understand that if you have this sickled blood, if you can get healthy donor cells in your system, they can help kind of counteract some of the effects of that other blood. So, if you don't mind. When we do transfusions, that's just giving you some of that blood and it stays in your body and kind of gets diluted out in the rest of the system. It does help, but it tends to overload our patients with iron. So what we often turn to, if we can, is red blood cell exchange. So that's taking out the cells that are affected by sickle cell and then replacing them with these healthy donor cells. And so we can do that. It takes approximately 2 to 4 hours to go through this process. And we can have kind of a couple options for it. We can either do it to address an acute problem. So say you come in with stroke, to try to prevent further effects of that stroke, we can exchange in that, hospitalization. We can also do this more preventatively. So if we know that you had a stroke in the past, we're going to continue doing this throughout your life to try to prevent you from having another stroke and keep that level of sickle cell percentage of cells in your body much lower. It also will address some of the acute and recurrent hospitalizations that you tend to have for acute chest syndrome or things like pain crises. There is a lessened risk of iron overload, but of course that still can occur because we're often leaving you with more cells because you were anemic from your sickle cell disease. We're leaving you with a little more than you had before, but this is a little bit easier way of managing that. And then it's also not without its risks. Of course, transfusion-related reactions, it can make people feel a little queasy, nauseous, but really what we'll focus on just in a moment is that red cell antibody production. Swear we're getting to the end, but I do want to touch on how this is actually performed because it makes it sound like we're draining all the blood out of you and then putting some back. We don't like that. So this is actually the machine we use, real fancy. It's called an apheresis machine, which just means we're trading part of the blood out and in. So you're going to click through a couple times. So we have your whole blood from the body going into the system. Click again, and it's going to go down in the bottom. And in the bottom is kind of like if you've ever been on a silly silo and you get spun and you get thrown on the wall. Well, this is what happens essentially with the blood. And if you click again, it's going to separate out into, into the red cells, which are kind of the densest part. They get thrown the farthest. And then the white cells, and then your plasma, which is the fluid part, stays in the middle. So we can sort it out that way. And then the machine can actually send the non-red cells back to you, and the red cells go into this bag in the back. So that's our waste product. And then you're also concurrently getting the new blood from our donors. So, like I said, it's happening at the same time. We're not draining you entirely out. So it's really pretty well tolerated and a pretty slick system in terms of switching things out. Like I said, it takes 2 to 4 hours to do this though. Now, what do we have to think about in terms of doing this? One is access. So I didn't mention that the vessels are often damaged kind of by these sickle cells over time, so that can be actually kind of a challenge for some of our sickle cell patients. So we do try to use just simple apheresis needles, one in, one out. You can click and show a photo of that. But then we also, if we need it for emergent use, we might do something that's a little more intense and get a line into your neck. And so that's very temporary. Obviously, we don't like being able to, or having to do this for our patients, but when you need access, you need access. And so this is a quick way to try to do those exchanges. I know, feel free to close your eyes if you want. And then the other thing that we often can do for our patients that are getting these more recurrent exchanges is something called a port. So it's got 2 chambers there in the upper right, I guess, and it will go just under the skin, and so we can access it there, and it's a more simple way to access you repeatedly. And then blood products. There simply is no replacement for human blood. They've tried, for all the engineering we can do, there is no replacement yet, and so that becomes, a real significant consideration in terms of treatment of our patients.
Sorry.
Happy little blood guy. And so really this comes down to the fact we need really dedicated donors. So for every one of these exchanges, we're using 6 to 8 on average units of blood. That means 6 to 8 different people came in and donated. So that takes a lot of people to even get one donation. And we're doing this, potentially every 4 to 6 weeks for some of these patients to try to keep them out of the hospital, try to keep them functioning in their daily lives, keep them out of pain. And so not only do we need donors, but especially with these donors or with these recipients that are getting regular transfusions, they have a pretty increased risk of forming antibodies against the blood. Because although we match for A, B, and O, and RH, those things we always talk about blood types, you actually have a lot more factors that you can make antibodies against. And so people that are getting a lot of blood are more likely to make antibodies, and then we can't use blood that has those antigens later. So we want to find really similar blood, which tends to come from genetically similar patients or donors. And so that's where we really need to call upon the non-Hispanic Black population, some of our minority patients, because they're going to have the best matched blood, and that we'll talk about just a bit in the Red for Life program. But I also do want to mention being negative is a good thing in our world because that means you're Rh negative. So even if you're not from one of these kind of more minority groups, if you have Rh negative blood, we can often use that for our donor pool as well, particularly for our red cell patients, for sickle cell. And then also just in general, that's also kind of the go-to blood. So I really encourage everyone to become a donor if you're able, or encourage your family members to become donors. But overall, there really is no replacement for that. So really quick whirlwind. I know I talk fast, but I'm honored to be able to speak here today. It's a really important subject, and I'm so glad that we have so many representatives that are so committed to this topic. So thank you.